Now come to the statement, Foreign Secretary David Lammy.
Well, with permission, Mr. Speaker, I will make a statement on last week's meeting of G7 foreign ministers. We met, Mr. Speaker, at a pivotal moment. Some members of this House may have doubted we could find common ground. Some of our global competitors may have hoped that we would fail. But after 36 hours of talks, we were united, Mr. Speaker. Britain was united with our allies to make our citizens more secure. National security is a foundation of this government's plan for change, and we are leading from the front. Mr. Speaker, the overriding priority was, of course, Ukraine. Last week in Jeddah, the United States and Ukraine reached a common position. A ceasefire offer is now on the table, and American weapons and intelligence are flowing once again. This demonstrated what this House has always known to have been true. Under President Zelensky's leadership, Ukraine is serious about peace, sincere in their efforts to pursue a just and lasting end to this appalling war, unrelenting in their determination to ensure that Ukraine remains democratic, free, strong and prosperous. At the G7, the UK and our allies were united in our unwavering support for Ukraine's defence of its freedom, united in support for Ukraine's pursuit of peace, united on what is required to make this happen. Now it is Putin who stands in the spotlight. Putin who must answer. Putin who must choose. Are you serious, Mr. Putin, about peace? Will you stop the fighting? Or will you drag your feet and play games? Play lip service to a ceasefire while still pummeling Ukraine? My warning to Mr. Putin is this: if you are serious, prove it with a full and unconditional ceasefire now. And if Putin does not deliver, Mr. Speaker, and I must tell the House that I currently see no sign yet that he is, the G7 meeting helped us ready the tools to get Russia to negotiate seriously. We're not waiting for the Kremlin. If they reject a ceasefire, we have more cards that we can play. We can all see the impact the G7's unprecedented sanctions have had on Russia's faltering economy. Social spending down, inflation and interest rates sky high. There can be no let-up in our efforts. In Canada, we discussed where we can go further to target their energy and defence sectors, further squeeze their oil revenues and use frozen Russian assets. At the same time, we will keep up our support to Ukraine. Europeans clearly need to shoulder our share of this responsibility. We in the UK are stepping up on drones, on munitions and on training, sending over 400 different capabilities to Ukraine and training over 50,000 recruits. And we've announced the biggest increase in UK defence spending since the end of the Cold War. We're urging our allies to do the same, so Ukraine is in the strongest possible position now and in any peace that follows. And tomorrow I will be hosting EU High Representative Kallas, the first such visits since we left the European Union. In this moment, Ukraine's friends should be working hand in glove, and that requires a new era in UK-EU security cooperation. Finally, we are taking the steps to ensure Russia does not come back for more. We know the history, Mr. Speaker. Budapest, Minsk, paper promises betrayed by Putin. Together with France, we are establishing a coalition willing to deter Russia from invading again. To be credible, it will need US support. But Britain and our allies recognise that we need to step up, and this government is leading the effort on multiple fronts. In the past week, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, convened the biggest gathering yet of those willing to play their part in ensuring Ukraine's future security. This followed my visit to Canada and my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary's trip to Paris. And this week, military planners from allies will gather for further discussions in the UK, co-chaired with France. Mr. Speaker, Ukraine was our top priority, but our unity extended beyond Ukraine. The G7 united in support for the fragile ceasefire in Gaza, the release of all hostages, the unhindered humanitarian aid into Gaza. And let me be clear to this House what I said to the G7. Hamas must release the hostages. For Israel to be secure, these terrorists can have no role in Gaza's future. But the complete blocking of aid in Gaza is appalling and unacceptable. Humanitarian aid should never be used as a political tool. We urge the Israeli government to change course. The G7 also discussed the Arab reconstruction plan for Gaza, an important signal on which we should build. The G7 also united behind an inclusive political transition in Syria. Stability in Syria bolsters UK security at home and abroad. We condemned the recent violence in Syria's coastal regions and called for those responsible to be held accountable. And we were united in increasing the pressure on Iran. Tehran is producing highly enriched uranium at a rate that makes a mockery of the limits set in the JCPOA. Iran can never be allowed to develop and acquire a nuclear weapon. President Trump has written to the Supreme Leader. And this weekend, the United States has responded strongly to the Houthi resumption of unacceptable attacks on international shipping. Iran must now change course, de-escalate, and choose diplomacy. Mr. Speaker, the G7 also kept the spotlight on the conflicts in Sudan and the DRC. We denounced the atrocities in Sudan. The warring parties must protect civilians, cease hostilities, and ensure unhindered humanitarian access. There was strong support for the conference I will host on Sudan next month, an important opportunity to get a political process moving. We also condemn the Rwanda-backed offensive in the eastern DRC, a flagrant breach of the DRC's territorial integrity. The M23 and Rwandan Defence Force must withdraw. All parties should support African-led mediation processes. Mr. Speaker, the G7 also reiterated our call for the restoration of Venezuelan democracy and reaffirmed our strong support for Guyana's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And as the G7 met, Armenia and Azerbaijan concluded negotiation on a historic peace agreement. We warmly welcome this achievement and encourage both sides to move to signature as soon as possible. It was a pleasure, Mr. Speaker, to be back in Canada, a proud sovereign nation in which I have family I visited since childhood and with whom we share a long history and a royal family. Their new leader, Prime Minister Carney, is in London today. I'm sure the whole House will congratulate him on his appointment. My fellow G7 ministers and I received a warm welcome to Quebec, home of my good friend, Minister Mélanie Joly. And we united behind a new Canadian-led initiative on maritime security, an example of their strong leadership. With growing threats from the Red Sea to the South China Sea, trade routes on which growth and all our economies rely, a strong collective response from the G7 matters to us all. Mr. Speaker, 50 years ago, a small group of Western leaders met just outside Paris, the origins of the G7. They did not agree on everything. They were from different political sides, 3 from the left, 3 from the right. It was a time of upheaval, war in the Middle East, an oil crisis and recession, the Bretton Woods system falling away. Many then as now were pessimistic about the ability of democracies to navigate the turbulence, but that generation rose to the challenge. With the G7, they tried something different. Its format allowed leaders to be honest with each other and so find common ground. Today, we must rise to these new challenges. In that same spirit of honesty and common purpose, Britain and our partners are stronger when we stand together. We are standing together right now. I commend this statement to the House.
So, Secretary of State, Dame Priti Patel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Foreign Secretary for the advanced sight of his statement today. There is much ground to cover in this statement in light of the vast global challenges we're all witnessing. On Ukraine, we continue to support Ukraine in this fight and the freedoms and values they are defending: democracy, liberty and the rule of law. It is very welcome that the US military aid and intelligence sharing has resumed, and vital that the US and Ukraine continue to work together in the face of this appalling conflict. May I ask the Foreign Secretary what discussions did he hold with US counterparts about the impact of the suspensions of intelligence and military support, and what is his assessment of the consequences caused? While we await further details of the proposed 30-day ceasefire, Russia's response shows exactly why the Euro-Atlantic community must be resolute in the face of Putin's aggression, and that he will seek to pursue long-held strategic objectives that he has not achieved on the battlefield through hypothetical negotiations, which means we must be robust. Britain must apply maximum pressure on the Kremlin, boost defence production and maintain our support for Ukraine's battlefield efforts. Britain must also use our convening role to work with allies who have other types of equipment that could plug capability gaps and broker extra support packages. Mr. Speaker, in the G7 Foreign Ministers' statement, there is a commitment to use extraordinary revenues stemming from the immobilised Russian sovereign assets. So can the Foreign Secretary confirm whether this means that the UK will go further than the £2.26 billion loan already announced off the back of the profits from sanctioned assets? And can he give an update on when proceeds from the sale of Chelsea FC will be in the hands of those most in need? Over the weekend, Mr. Speaker, we heard the Prime Minister said that he was planning for his potential peacekeeping initiative is now moving into an operational phase. Is the Foreign Secretary able to explain what moving into an operational phase means in practice, especially for armed forces? What planning is underway? What will our contribution to peacekeeping consist of? Over what timeframe would deployment be launched? And how will our armed forces be supported? Can he inform the House which allies in this coalition of the willing have expressed interest? What will they offer? And what discussions are underway with the US on deterrence and security guarantees to ensure that an invasion like this can never, ever happen again? Turning to the Middle East, Mr. Speaker, we are absolutely united on the position that Iran-backed terrorist Hamas can have no role in Gaza's future. But what has the government done to pursue an end to this brutal regime? And what discussion has he held with Middle Eastern counterparts on their proposed plan for the future of Gaza? Now is the time for maximum pressure on Hamas from the international community. They must release every single hostage. Is the UK directly involved in discussions to drive action in a positive direction? On Syria, Mr. Speaker, was there discussion about the ongoing status of HTS as a proscribed terrorist group? Following the government's lifting of 24 sanctions on entities linked to the deposed Assad regime, does the recent violence change the government's assessment of the merits of lifting these kinds of sanctions? Mr. Speaker, we understand from the BBC that the UK did not directly participate in the US airstrikes on the Houthi targets at the weekend, but that our armed forces provided routine refuelling support to the US. Can the Foreign Secretary share with the House what the precise nature of the UK support was? In particular, given that the UK conducted multiple joint airstrikes with the US last year against Houthi militant targets to degrade their ability to threaten freedom of navigation. So can the Foreign Secretary explain why on this occasion it was decided that we would not deploy our own strike capabilities? And does he assess that there has been an increase in threat to the freedom of navigation in the Red Sea and to British vessels and personnel? If so, what is the government's overall approach to this threat and to the Houthis? Are hard power options still on the table as they were last year? Will the government ramp up sanctions and pressure on the Houthis and, importantly, on Iran, the malign force in the region that continues to back them? What steps is the government taking to interdict weapons flowing from Iran to the Houthis? And what discussions has the Foreign Secretary had with his American counterparts on the US approach to Iran more broadly? And where does the UK fit in this? Mr. Speaker, the G7 statement also made reference to the range of challenges posed by China. Our key partners are alert to the threat China poses, but this government seems to be oblivious to it. As China threatens global security, our national interests, and to put bounties on the heads of Hong Kongers living here, we've also seen the energy secretaries following the Chancellor and the Foreign Secretary kowtowing to the Chinese Communist Party, and the Foreign Secretary and the Home Secretary, who are responsible for national security, are now the cheerleaders for the Chinese super embassy planning application. So will the Foreign Secretary disclose in full all contacts and communications between his department, Downing Street, the Chinese Authority and MHCLG about this matter? Does he recognise the anxiety this planning application is causing to the groups who are threatened by China? Will he accept the threats and risks that mean China must join Iran on the enhanced tiers of furs? And finally, Mr. Speaker, on the Chagos surrenders deal, was this discussed with his US counterparts? Will he commit to present a draft treaty to the House before it is signed? And how can he justify handing over billions of pounds of British taxpayers' money to Mauritius instead of defending our sovereignty?
Well, I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker, particularly for the cross-party nature of the Secretary of State for the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, I'm a little jet lagged. I got off a plane at 6 o'clock, so you'll forgive me. But I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for the manner of her remarks, particularly on Ukraine, and there were a number of questions which I will seek to deal with. She's absolutely right that Zelensky has made absolutely clear that he is committed to peace. She asked me about the US decision on a military pause in aid and on intelligence aid. I'm pleased to say that our assessment is that that pause, as she will know, was for a short period, not an extended period, and therefore it has not had a material effect, but we were pleased to see that resume, and we were pleased to see what flowed from Jeddah, which was the United States, European allies, and President Zelensky in Ukraine absolutely square now with the need for that ceasefire, and it is for Putin to unconditionally now accept that ceasefire. The ball is in his court, and I was pleased to be able to discuss these matters with Secretary Rubio over the course of the 3 days at the G7, but also with Vice President Vance yesterday morning at his residence in Washington. She rightly asks about Russian assets. Let me make clear, Russia must pay for the damage it is causing Ukraine. I'm delighted that the first £752 million payment of the UK's £2.26 billion loan to be repaid by the profits has been generated on Russian sanctioned assets so far, but she knows that there is rightfully a discussion about moving from freezing to seizing. It's important that if we were to move in that direction, that there is unanimity amongst the G7, of course, and that there is a way forward within the European Union for those countries that are most exposed, and as she would expect, at pace, we are discussing these very same issues. She also asks about UK troops on the ground. At stake is not only the future of Ukraine, but the collective security of our continent and therefore Britain's direct national interests. And that's why the Prime Minister has said that Europe needs to step up, and the UK is prepared, of course, to consider committing British troops on the ground, but there must be a US backstop. There is a further meeting in London this week to continue to get into the operational detail. The Prime Minister and I are pleased, alongside the Defence Secretary, that the coalition of the willing is growing. It is right that we consider carefully what would be required on the ground, but I know that she will know too that what is very important is the monitoring exercise of what is put in place. And she, like me, no doubt, will have seen the operation that was run by the OSCE. I saw that operation in January, just before the fighting began in February. That would not be adequate this time round. And so, rightly and properly, we must get into the granular detail of what would be required. Yes, of course, as a European family, but also involving nations like Canada. And I had a commitment from Minister Melanie Joly that Canada is willing to step up to be part of that coalition going forward, but there will be others in that coalition of the willing, and so we will look at these issues in detail over the coming days. She, of course, mentions the situation in Gaza and the Middle East, and let me be absolutely clear, we were all united. There can be no role for Hamas. We welcome the work that has been done by the Arab Quint as a direction of travel. The United Kingdom wants to continue to work with the Arab Quint on strengthening that proposal, particularly on the security guarantees that the Israelis would rightfully need, their assurance that October the 7th can never, ever happen again. She also raises the situation in Syria. The awful clashes during the weekend of the 8th and 9th of March led to the death of more than 1,000 people. And we condemned the violence at the time, and the Minister for the Middle East updated the House on the 10th of March. It is critical that the interim administration in Syria respects and protects all of Syria's minorities, and that is why it was heartening to see the agreement last week between the interim administration and the Syrian Democratic Forces, particularly in northeast Syria, and this was obviously a topic of much discussion. She rightly also mentions the strikes in the US. Now, since the 19th of November 2023, the Houthis have targeted international commercial shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden and attacked British and American warship. This cannot go unchecked. It is totally unacceptable, and it must be dealt with. We don't comment, of course, on other nations' military operations, but I can confirm that we did not take part in the strikes over the weekend, but we are in close touch with our US friends and on the need to act with the Houthis and what they are doing in the Red Sea. She talks about the government's approach to China. What I can assure her is from this government, there will not be 7 different approaches to China, which is what we experienced under the last government. Ping-ponging about over the course of those 14 years, and that calamity of a United Kingdom Prime Minister having a beer with the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. I guarantee her that will not happen under this government. And quite properly, I and the Home Secretary made representations, as she knows, to the planning process about the security issues that must be kept in mind as the proper procedures are followed for China's application. And she knows too that we also have our concerns about our embassy in China and its proper operation. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Emily Thornbury.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm so pleased to see the Foreign Secretary this weekend continuing to lead our allies in support of Ukraine, and equally pleased to see that he has expressed his support for the issue of moving from freezing to seizing Russian assets. We do have 18 billion of them held in the UK. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have to say, though, if we're serious about doing this, then I wondered if we could start getting on with it. So the question I have is, what moves is his department making for example, putting legislation on the books which would allow us to seize those assets when the right time comes? I'm glad to hear that there are discussions to put, but I wondered whether there have been pressure put on our G7 and EU allies who still sit on the remaining £300 billion of assets that also perhaps need to be seized at this stage. And has he considered a UN General Assembly resolution providing the legal basis for coordinated asset seizures?
Well, I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for her question and, of course, her leadership of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Can I reassure her that we continue to work closely with our allies on this issue, including discussions, lengthy discussions that we had at the G7, Madam Deputy Speaker. But let me also emphasise it is important in this particular area that any way forward is a pooling of that exercise. I don't believe that it would be right for the UK in this instance to act unilaterally, and therefore this is a multilateral endeavour and discussion. She's right, and I get the emphasis of her question that we should work at pace on this, and can I reassure her that we are?
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Callum Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I also thank the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement. Like him, I will focus on Ukraine. Last week, President Zelensky announced his willingness to accept an immediate ceasefire. In response, Vladimir Putin intensified his attacks on Ukraine. This gives the lie to Putin's cheap talk about agreeing with the idea of a ceasefire. His goals remain the same: destroying Ukraine's sovereignty and turning it into a satellite state of Russia. The only way to strengthen and achieve a just and lasting peace is by strengthening Ukraine in the face of Putin's brutality. So I was slightly alarmed to hear the Foreign Secretary say that we can only seize Russian assets if we progress by unanimity. If the US refuses to seize Russian assets, will the Foreign Secretary take a lead with European partners so this support can flow? And can he also say what is stopping him from unlocking the £2.5 billion generated from the sale of Chelsea Football Club, held here in the UK, that should already have provided humanitarian aid to Ukraine? The Foreign Secretary referred to the work that ministers have been doing to build a coalition of the willing to support any final peace agreement in Ukraine, which my party strongly supports. But I do ask the Foreign Secretary if he can be more specific. What levels of support have other countries committed? And what progress has he made in securing a backstop security guarantee from the United States? Liberal Democrats have warned repeatedly that Donald Trump's actions are emboldening Putin. Last month, Trump said Russia should rejoin the G7 if a peace settlement is agreed. This would be unjust and wrong. Did the Foreign Secretary make clear to his G7 counterparts that the UK would oppose Russia rejoining the G7? And given that Donald Trump is not a reliable ally, Liberal Democrats have argued that the UK must lead in Europe to reduce the continent's reliance on the United States. We support a pan-European rearmament bank so Europe's defences can be rapidly rebuilt. Yet last week we saw proposals from the European Commission for EU structures that could leave the UK out. So will the Foreign Secretary use his meeting with High Representative Callas tomorrow to make sure that the UK plays a full part in European efforts to the benefit of our security and our defence industry?
Yes. Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for continuing that cross-party unity. He's usually pretty on top of the details. Can I just say to him, on the sovereign assets issue, it is not the United States that has raised consistent concerns about sovereign assets. It's not the United States in this instance that's more exposed than others. It's actually within Europe, Belgian colleagues that have found themselves more exposed, and German colleagues that have previously been resistant to this issue. But of course, there's a change, an administration in Germany coming, and so we'll see what their assessment is. On the issue of those funds from Abramovich that, of course, we want to use. Can I just say, and I should have said this to the Right Honourable Lady, we inherited this from the last government. 2.5 years, no progress was made. I am frustrated with that lack of progress, and I am doing everything I can in order to reach a resolution in this matter. And if not, of course, I've got to consider all the tools that are available to government. But at this stage, what I want is to be able to act quickly, given that he knows and I know and we all know that Ukraine need those funds now. And therefore, we urge, working with other colleagues and Mr. Abramovich's lawyers, we urge action now. Can I say to him, there was no discussion of Russia joining the G7. I mean, no discussion whatsoever. The G7 is a family of democratic nations committed to the rule of law. Russia under Putin has put themselves way outside of that club and that necessary partnership. I see no basis at the moment on which Russia could enter the G7, and indeed there would be other candidates way ahead of Russia with that to be the place. Now, I'm delighted that the Lib Dems have a proposal for a rearmament bank. I would just say to them that Ursula von der Leyen got there before them.
To ensure all colleagues can get in, questions will have to be short, and if answers continue to be long, there'll be some disappointed backbenchers. Ruba Huck.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome my right honourable friend's strong statement that blockading all aid into Gaza, including UK-raised aid, is appalling and unacceptable. So what discussions did he have with G7 colleagues about what can be done about this provocative action during Ramadan? And what consequences are there for what people are saying is a breach of international law?
Well, my honourable friend is right. This is a breach of international law. Israel, quite rightly, must defend its own security. But we find the lack of aid, it's now been 15 days since aid got into Gaza, unacceptable, hugely alarming and very worrying. And we would urge Israel to get back to the amount of trucks that we were seeing going in, way beyond 600, so that Palestinians can get the necessary humanitarian support they need at this time.
Mark Pritchard.
Deputy Speaker, can I welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement today and for all his hard work travelling all around the world trying to make us all safer. He mentions the OSCE. And whilst the previous model may not be fit in Ukraine for the future, I hope we recognise the important role of the OSCE will play in future elections in Ukraine, and certainly some new model perhaps alongside a security force. But may I just bring his attention to the joint statement from Canada, where it says, the highlights, quote, Iran is the principal source of regional instability, and, quote, some would argue, of course, global instability and insecurity. And in his statement today, he says, quote, Tehran is producing highly enriched uranium at a rate that makes a mockery of the limits set in the JCPOA. So can I ask the Foreign Secretary, if Israel, with or without US support, takes direct action to make the world a safer place and to stop Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon, will the UK government support that action?
Well, I'm very grateful for the honourable gentleman raising this issue of Iran and their desire to have nuclear capability. We stand in the way of that, and working with the Germans and the French, we are determined to use all diplomatic efforts to bring about a conclusion to that desire. And I discussed that, of course, with Secretary of State Rubio alongside my French and German counterparts at the G7. But we also discussed maximum pressure, and we also discussed that nothing is off the table as we discuss these issues with Iran, and we are running out of time to reach a resolution to this issue.
Blair McDougall.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I welcome the Foreign Secretary's uncompromising message to Vladimir Putin, and I wonder if he would add to that with a clear message that there can be no peace while the tens of thousands of Ukrainian children who've been stolen from their parents and scattered around Russia are not returned. And I wonder if he shares my concern at reports that the humanitarian research lab at Yale University has been defunded by Elon Musk. while they were tracking hundreds of those abducted children? And will he work with international allies to make sure that that data is not lost and ensure that it contributes to getting those children back to their anguished families?
Well, can I congratulate my honourable friend for his question, for the horrors of what the Russian regime has done to those children, for the manner in which, and he will be pleased and the whole House will be pleased, that we have through our ODA budget supported efforts to retrieve and work alongside those children. I was so pleased to spend time with some of those children on my last visit to Ukraine with Madam Zelensky, but also on the previous visit with the work that is going on. And we keep this issue absolutely in our sight. It cannot be a negotiating tool in any future discussions that we have with Mr. Putin.
Sir Gavin Williamson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And if I can draw attention to my register of interest, the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs rightly set out a broad range of challenges that were discussed there very well and very detailed, but one area he touched on was the threat of the Houthis, and of course they're being supported by Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and of course you have the Republic of Somaliland, which is the only democratic country in the area that's valiantly trying to fight these terrorist threats. Will the Secretary of State commit to his department to working with the government of the Republic of Somaliland to deal with those threats that they're facing, but we're also facing?
Well, can I reassure the honourable gentleman that this was also raised in discussion with G7 colleagues. He's absolutely right. Al-Shabaab is a deep, deep concern, and the terrorism that emanates from their activities is something that we closely monitor and work with partners on. And yes, of course, I can give him that assurance.
Happy St Patrick's Day to you, and happy birthday to my dad, who no doubt is watching. He likes to keep an eye on me, Madam Deputy Speaker. A lot of time for the TV. The Secretary of State will know that there are a number of Sudanese British people in Newcastle. I've raised some of their cases with him today. They remain devastated by what they see and what their family members are going through on television and in the media, and so I'm thanking him and his team for the support that they've given me and my constituents so far. But in advance of the conference to which he's just referred, can I urge him to engage the AU, the Commonwealth and the Arab League to make sure that the political process to which he referred in his statement is fit for purpose?
Well, can I wish my honourable friends, father, all good wishes too on his birthday, and thank him for the way he has continued to raise these issues of conflict in Africa in the chamber. He will be pleased that I met with the African Union at the G20 a few weeks ago. We will work with them for the conference on April the 15th. We expect them to attend alongside other African nations. It's hugely important that we make some breakthrough, not just on the humanitarian side, but on the political side, to bring this conflict to an end.
Deputy Speaker, the Foreign Secretary is clearly a busy man, and I understand why we haven't seen him since the Prime Minister announced a 40% cut to the overseas development budget on February the 25th. So can I ask him now, were the consequences of slashing overseas aid discussed at the G7, and how did he explain to them that withdrawing life-saving aid to the poorest people on the planet, thereby making them even more dependent on Russia and China, would in the long run make us all safer and more secure?
Well, can I just say to the honourable gentleman that occasionally he's wrong. And very occasionally, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister made a statement about defence spending. It was a statement that was applauded right across the European families and certainly in the United States, and it was essential. The following week, the Prime Minister came back and made another statement about leading efforts within Europe, and I was sat right next to him. I'm just going to say to the Honourable Gentleman needs to get his eyes tested, Madam Deputy Speaker, because that was good. On the issue of development aid, which is an important issue, we have not made an ideological decision. We do not want cliff edges. And it's important that the Honourable Member knows that when one looks at foreign policy, diplomatic efforts, development efforts, and of course hard power, this is a family of tools. He should never forget that the war in Ukraine has cost the African continent $7 billion. And that's right, it's right that we defend in our defences, but it's also right that we continue to spend aid in Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think my constituency neighbour was reading my notes earlier by raising the issue that he did, but I'll raise it again because I don't believe we can say enough about the 19,546 stolen children from Ukraine and the Humanitarian Research Lab at Yale University, who have just had their funding cut by the United States, were not only trying to reunite those children with their families, they were also documenting some of the war crimes that are currently taking place. So can my right honourable friend say a little more about how we're going to ensure that work is not lost, and also can he say what we're doing to support families who will be reunited with children who will be so severely traumatised?
Yeah.
Secretary.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. Can I just reassure her that the UK does continue to track Russia's deportation of Ukrainian children, which is a clear violation of international law. I met with Madam Zelensky in Kyiv back in February on this issue. The UK was very pleased to see another group of children returned via Qatari mediation in September 2024. We're consistently raising awareness of child deportations in our comms and across multilateral forums like the OSCE, and of course in ensuring that in any changes we make to development spend, that we are making sure that our commitments to humanitarian efforts are made to Ukraine. This is an area where she could expect to see the UK continue to fund support.
Morrison.
Deputy Speaker, it's good to hear that the G7 believes that Iran should not be allowed to build a nuclear bomb. It's a statement of the obvious. It's also good to hear that President Trump has sent a strongly worded letter to the Supreme Leader. But does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that the JCPOA was dead in the water the minute President Trump pulled out in 2018? And he talks of what we might now do and that nothing is off the table. Would he confirm that that includes military action?
Secretary.
Well, I must let Mr. Trump speak for himself when he says that nothing is off the table in dealing with Iran. But I am pleased that in working alongside the US, they recognise the important role that we, the French and German, play. They recognise that maximum pressure is essential. And we have made clear to the Iranians that that step back and the sanctions that would follow, squeezing the Iranian economy at a time when everyone accepts that Iran is weak, is not what they want to see. So they need to get serious about their nuclear ambitions, and we will work on all tracks. And of course, he will have read, just like I have, that military endeavour is absolutely an option that certainly our Israeli colleagues remind us about on a pretty regular basis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I draw the House's attention to my entry in the Register of Members' Financial Interests and welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement today, and also thank him for his leadership he's shown over the last few weeks, in particular on Ukraine. The Foreign Secretary mentioned discussions he has had with his Canadian counterpart. Following the G7 meeting he attended, is he able to share what further progress he has made in building the much-needed coalition of the willing in order to guarantee Ukraine's security?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. A number of nations are stepping up and coming forward, of course, alongside the United Kingdom and France, and Canada is absolutely one of them. I don't want to give a running commentary because there are further meetings this week, and I think it is right that when we're talking about committing troops particularly, that he will understand that different countries have different requirements in terms of going to their own parliaments, the way that they speak to their own nations about these matters, and so it's right that I leave them to do that and don't make announcements from the dispatch box.
Alison Bennett.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the 25th of February, the Foreign Secretary told me in this chamber that he was minded to move, and I quote, from freezing to seizing Russian assets, and I note that he's used that phrase again this afternoon. Given the increasingly mercurial nature of our American allies in their support of Ukraine, what progress has been made, and what is the Foreign Secretary's best estimate of when our Ukrainian friends will be able to benefit from those frozen assets?
Secretary.
Well, I understand why the Honourable Lady raises the question as she does, but as I said to the Liberal Democrat spokesman, this is not an issue where the US is the blocker. It's an issue where there are nations within Europe that are more exposed than others. And it is best, as I said to the chair of the Select Committee, that we act multilaterally, and that is the issue. But we're working at pace.
Fred Thomas.
For the Foreign Secretary in Canada representing our country, and a big weekend for the Royal Navy in Plymouth. And the Foreign Secretary alluded to increased cooperation with our EU, NATO allies in terms of defence activity. In Plymouth this weekend, the Deputy French Ambassador was down to unveil Ariadne. This is a new capability that the French and British navies now hold, unmanned, uncrewed, completely autonomous, end-to-end, 12-metre long, underwater, mine countermeasure vessels, a remarkable feat of technology. And will he join me in celebrating this feat of cooperation?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I say first to my honourable friend, thank him for his service. He will be pleased that maritime security was such a big discussion point at the G7, and I thank Canada for that. We are a great maritime nation, working with our colleagues, and can I assure him there will be more on this issue in the SDR, which is to follow.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement. It seems to me that Putin views the failure to seize the frozen assets as a sign of Western weakness. And if there are some reluctant countries in this, given that the Prime Minister is rightly leading a coalition of the willing, could the Prime Minister and the government lead a coalition of the willing of those nations who will seize those frozen assets?
Well, can I say that it's right and proper, as right across Europe we see a cost of living crisis, that we pool our efforts, but also that respective Treasury departments and finance ministers are satisfied that this would not have a detrimental effect on the global economy. Those are the necessary discussions that are being had. He knows my emphasis, but can I assure him that Europe is more united on these issues than we're currently seeing from reform?
Steve Kemp.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'd also like to thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement to the House today. Last week, I hosted a Westminster Hall debate on the International Fund for Israeli-Palestinian Peace. And I wonder if the Foreign Secretary could advise the House if he was able to raise the matter at the G7 Foreign Ministers meeting, and if he might commit to a further meeting with MPs to discuss the UK's commitment to that fund.
Well, we were able to discuss Gaza and link that discussion to a broader discussion on development spend and our commitment to Gaza. He will know particularly that the United Kingdom supports the Palestinian Authority and the necessary reforms that they need to make. And can I assure him that I, or indeed the Minister for the Middle East, will meet and discuss these issues further.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In his statement, the Foreign Secretary describes the blocking of aid to Gaza as appalling and unacceptable. Why doesn't he also confirm it's illegal, it's in breach of international law, and the continued bombardment of Gaza is likewise, as is the bombardment of the West Bank? British government going to finally say to Israel, we will no longer supply weapons to you, we will no longer continue security cooperation while you continue to illegally occupy territory and commit international war crimes in both Gaza and the West Bank?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I say to the right honourable gentleman that I did say in my contribution that it is in breach of international humanitarian law, and of course we have spoken to the Israelis about those concerns, and indeed he will recall the decision that I made back in September of last year to suspend arms, and it was largely because of that breach.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Earlier today in Parliament I chaired an event to remember the victims of the appalling chemical weapons attack at Halabja on the 16th of March 1988, carried out by the vicious Saddam Hussein regime. They thank the UK for our help and friendship over the years. So does my right honourable friend agree that this and current crises show the need for a strong UK? And what I mean by a strong UK is strong armed forces, strong diplomacy with our superb diplomats, soft power with the World Service and the British Council, our alliances in Africa, in the Gulf and in Europe, and that these are vital to preserve and protect the international rules-based system that we all rely on.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, the honourable gentleman put his remarks incredibly well. Can I associate myself with the remarks he made about that appalling atrocity and absolutely say crystal clear that the United Kingdom, as a P5 member, it's hugely important that we continue to support our armed services and hard power, but also our soft power, our diplomatic efforts and our development spend. We will still be the 6th biggest development spender in the world. Is hugely, hugely important.
Richard Ford.
Madam Deputy Speaker, last spring the UK joined the United States in conducting 5 combined joint naval and airstrikes against the Houthis. This weekend the US conducted airstrikes without participation from the RAF except in terms of routine refuelling support. Why the change? What does it signal about British foreign policy, and does he consider that getting US involvement in a backstop in Ukraine is more challenging when the US has to operate alone against the Houthis?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, the United Kingdom was involved to the extent of supporting US efforts on refuelling. I don't think that it would be right for me to comment on the detail of any military exercise, but can I reassure him that we continue to work very closely with our friends in the United States, and as he would expect, I was briefed on these issues alongside the Prime Minister and others.
Final question, Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank very much the Secretary of State for his statement and his very strong words. They're much appreciated. I very much welcome the reaffirmation of support for Ukraine contained within the statement, as well as a continuation of support for a peaceful resolution in Israel and Gaza. However, peace cannot come at the appeasement of Russia or the Hamas terrorist murderers that they are. So how will the Secretary of State ensure that peace will have at its foundation respect rather than threat? And what more can be done in the interim to ensure that children from both sides in Israel and Gaza border and in Ukraine can have the food, the medicine, the clothing and the education while these complex needs are sorted out? Thank you so much.
Secretary.
Well, I'm sure the whole House is hugely grateful for the humanity that the honourable gentleman has shown once again on the issue of children on both sides of this conflict. I think it's horrendous that when one looks at the scenes of those hostages coming out, that amongst those hooded young men with Kalashnikovs were children. This cannot be right or proper. But at the same time, it cannot be right to starve children of the humanitarian aid, the medical supplies that they need at this time, whilst we seek to deal with the problems of Hamas and get those hostages out. I always in my remarks hold up the prospect of a two-state solution as a way through this most complex and difficult of challenges. And I'm very grateful for the way in which the honourable gentleman has raised his remarks in the House today.
That concludes the G7 statement. I'll give the front benches a few moments to swap over.